Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and I'm here to talk about a story that I'm pulling out from the latest issue of New Worlds magazine, the 60th anniversary of Michael Moorcock's editorship. I already posted a video that gives you an overview of the whole magazine and what this is about. And true to what I've been saying recently about wanting to pull certain stories out, I'm doing that with this one. And the stories I'm going to pull out mostly are going to be stories that are part of other author deep dives. Like one I'm pulling out of this magazine for a separate video just about the story is the Thomas M. Dish story, because I do want to, even though I haven't started it yet, I do want to do a series on trying to read everything I can get my hands on by Thomas M. Dish. So I haven't started that yet, but then they published this. And so I'm going to start with Dish's most recent story. Start his series with Dish's most recent story because it's relevant to the fact that this just came out in this magazine. Now I'm going to do the same with Michael Moorcock's Wigan, which is the cover story of the magazine, of course. It's a Jerry Cornelius story. I'll be doing a separate video of that, but of course out of the whole publication order, since it's his most recent piece. And there are some other stories that just merit a deeper discussion than what, if you've watched like my early Weird Tales overviews where I'm just going through all these short stories that are just these little incidental things that aren't all that interesting, and I just quickly talk about them and move on. There are certain stories that do kind of cry out for a deeper discussion about the story. And this issue has a couple of those, even though I'm probably not going to try to do a deep dive, read everything I can get my hands on in publication order about these authors. I'm still going to pull these stories out and talk to them and talk about those stories on their own, separate from the issue. The first one I'm doing, the first one I'm doing is probably already up on YouTube by the time you see this video. That's the Thomas M. Dish story. Second one is by Pamela Zoline. I don't know a whole lot about Pamela Zoline. I can tell you she was born in Chicago, Illinois, June 20th, 1941. And her first story is titled The Heat Death of the Universe. It was published in New Worlds magazine in July of 1967. And that's why Miss Zoline was brought back to contribute a story to this issue, because she is from those early days of Michael Moorcock's editorship when he really shook things up and really started the new wave in science fiction. And Zoline was one of those authors that was writing this new wave type of fiction. The Heat Death of the Universe, I've never read it myself, but it has a very big reputation. Now, the thing about Pamela Zoline, though, is her bibliography is ridiculously short. I can only dig up 8 works by her, and that includes 8 fiction works by her, and that includes the story that's in the latest New Worlds. She also did write an article about J.G. Ballard's crashed cars exhibit at an art gallery. Very interesting article. But her short story, what she did was she took inspiration from Bears Discover Fire by Terry Bisson. So I also recently did with Emily a video about that story, which I read way back in 1990 in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. I read it, didn't think much of it. The next year when the awards came up for 1990 stories, it won both the Hugo and Nebula Award for Best Short Story. And that really shocked me because I didn't think it was a very good story at all. So here I am, 30 years later, and Pamela Zoline publishes this story that's inspired by Bears Discover Fire, which she calls Bears Discover Singularity. Without going into Bears Discover Fire, because just did a separate video just talking about that, because I thought it was significant. I mean, it is a Hugo and Nebula Award winning short story. It was very early in Terry Bisson's career. It was only his seventh story, so it really did put him on the map as a writer. Um, but it's just this really weird story that you would never even guess is a science fiction story and in any way. It doesn't seem like it belongs in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. So Pamela Zoline, I'm finally getting to it. She decided to write this story that is inspired by Bears Discover Fire, which takes it further, and it's titled Bears Discover Singularity. It's her most recent work. It's her eighth work in my bibliography, only available in this issue of New Worlds, which is, it should still be available if you, in the United States, if you go to the Z Sings website, they're a used, mostly a used bookseller specializing in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Very good people, very nice people, very good to do business with. They are carrying issues of this New Worlds here in the United States and selling it. So you can purchase it from them. And the story, um, Pamela Zoline was a very much an experimental writer. Okay, she's kind of, well, she's not like Ballard, but she's definitely of that generation. A lot more literate, a lot more experimental. Her stories are not traditional stories; they're very different. So this story, you have again the bears are just kind of standing back observing while Zoline goes through and talks about all the things human beings are doing to destroy this planet and one another and the environment. Okay. The only difference here, and spoiler coming up, but I'll try to keep it basic. The only difference in this story is at the ending, the bears are not still just standing by watching. Okay. Um, I just kind of spoiled it. I didn't give you too many specifics, but still spoiled it. But you know what? It doesn't matter because this story is brilliantly written. It's just such a cool writing style and so densely packed with thoughts and ideas about our world. It's great. It's awesome. It's wonderful. I'm not going to give it a top tail. I don't think it quite reached that, but it was a remarkable story and makes me want to read more by Pamela Zoline. I know I only have 7 others that I can read, but I'm kind of looking forward to tracking those 7 down and reading them and seeing what kind of other incredible things she can come up with. And she never did publish a novel, so don't look for anything like that from Zoline. Only short stories, I believe. Let me double check that to be sure. Yeah, everything here is short stories. Heat Death of the Universe, The Holland of the Mind, Sheep, Annika and the Wolves, Instructions for Exiting This Building in Case of Fire, Busy About the Tree of Life, Odd Fleet, and Bears Discover Singularity. That's it. That's all I got. So, um, you know, reading a lot of Ballard lately and then reading through this issue of New Worlds. what has happened in science fiction? Okay, you go back to amazing stories. You go back to the 1930s. You got a lot of what are basically kids excited by this new science fiction thing where there's aliens and robots and other planets and stuff, and they're really excited by that imagination, and they start writing this stuff. But they really don't know how to write, but they're doing their damnedest, and they do learn, and they do strive to get better and grow. And some of them were successful, others were not. Some of them continued to write really great science fiction all the way up to their death. People like Clifford Simak and Jack Williamson never lost relevance in the field, even though they started in the 1930s and they kept writing. You know, Jack Williamson was still writing after the year 2000, and his stuff never lost relevance. It was always, always so good. But you go back to those 1930s issues, and a lot of them are poorly written, but they did their best. They weren't writers, they hadn't gone to college yet. They were really more interested in becoming scientists and engineers. But they wanted to try their hand at this writing thing, and they did. And they got published because the magazines didn't have anybody else to go to for stuff, just these fans that wanted to write. Okay. So then along came John Campbell, and he's going, well, science fiction is great, and but all the stuff that's being published is just really amateurish, including his own work. And he felt there was a need to take a step forward and improve the quality, improve the science that was in it, but also improve the writing a bit. I mean, it didn't get Hemingway level high literature under Campbell, but he did pull things forward a lot during the golden age. He did make a difference, and he did make things better. So now those kids just writing these, really poorly done adventure stories, they weren't getting published in Astounding Science Fiction because John Campbell wanted them to do better. And in most cases, he took them under his wing and mentored them to do better. In some cases, he was successful, in other cases, he wasn't. But he did still set the bar a little higher to where the people submitting to the magazines needed to have at least some basic professionalism in their writing. And he was successful at demanding that, and got some good stories. 1950s come along, and we bump that up again. We come out, we science fiction is exploring things other than the hard sciences. Science fiction is, some authors are getting into fantasy. The magazine of fantasy and science fiction comes about. Um, you have a lot more people taking interest in science fiction. You have book publishing coming in, wanting science fiction novels to fuel the interests caused by headlines about UFOs, and of course headlines about the atomic bomb and atomic power. And people were taking interest in the future and technology. And science fiction was leading the way in that. Science fiction had already been leading the way in that, but science fiction needed to take another step forward and get a little bit better. Not quite. You couldn't just do this stock standard Campbell astounding hard science fiction story anymore. You needed more of a variety, and so you got authors like Judith Merrill and Richard Matheson, and later on Brian Aldiss, Robert Silverberg, J.G. Ballard, Harlan Ellison, um, Poul Anderson, and a wide variety of other authors coming out and writing stuff that was better than what was published in the 1940s. Alfred Bester is another one. So you keep taking these steps forward, and then in the 1960s with Moorcock, what happened is he wanted to really shake things up and pull speculative fiction. You know, he didn't want to call it science fiction anymore because he wanted to get away from that club of engineers writing stories. Um, and he wanted to make it real literature, as good and as relevant as the very best of what was out there. You know, he didn't want James Joyce and Thomas Pynchon writing stuff that was better than what he was publishing in New Worlds. And so he looked for a much, much more intelligent, more willing to experiment and stretch out and try new things. He was looking for authors like that, and he found them in people like Pamela Zoline and Thomas M. Dish, and he published Norman Spinrad, Keith Roberts, and he published all these, Christopher Priest, published all these people that were just, they were real writers, and they were adventurous writers, willing to try things that other people weren't willing to try. You know, while other people were just writing books that were ordinary adventures, like The Mind Monsters by Howard L. Corey. Um, Moorcock wanted stuff like Pamela Zoline wrote. And so Bears Discover Singularity is still in that kind of style, very experimental, very brilliantly written, a very intelligent story. You could argue for days about whether or not it was science fiction, but New Worlds under Moorcock wasn't a science fiction magazine anymore. It was a speculative fiction magazine, and that difference was intended to reflect this fact that it wasn't just all about hard science anymore. That writers could write things that, when you read it, weren't really science fiction at all. Like one story that I didn't pull out as a separate thing is a short story with John Sladek. It's just about this astronaut, and there were astronauts. The story was originally published in 1966 in New Worlds, and there were astronauts in 1966, and they did come from small towns originally, and they did go back home, and there were parades and stuff. So the story was not really relating any kind of science fictional situation, other than the fact that it did involve a scientific technology. But it was a real world situation, one that could happen in anybody's hometown in 1966 if they happened to have had a guy go off and become part of NASA's astronaut program. You know, and I Dream of Jeannie was on television. That was all about NASA and astronauts that wanted to go into space. So, you know, it didn't have to be in the future or dealing with time travel or alien invasion or other dimensions in order to be in Moorcock's new worlds. It just had to be a damn good story. And so this issue of the magazine and Pamela Zoline's story are a welcome walk back in time to a time when science fiction and speculative fiction were pulled up to something really high, and the bar was raised really high. And the reason I'm talking about all this, and I think I already did talk about it in the video about about the overview of New Worlds magazine, but hey, it's on my mind and it's interesting right now. It's got my passion, and that is the fact that they raised the bar. And you know, when you go back and read the stuff that was published in 1930s, you have to understand what was going on then, and that it's not going to be like Ernest Hemingway or Thomas Pynchon. It's going to be simpler. But after after Moorcock, after Ellison's Dangerous Visions, when you sit down and read stuff today, the bar has been raised. Authors, you should be writing on the level of Pamela Zoline. You should be writing on the level of Michael Moorcock. You should be writing on the level of Thomas M. Dish. You should be writing on the level of John Sladek. If your work isn't that good, you need to keep working at it and make it that good. That is where That is the standard now. That is the foundation. Those authors worked damn hard in the 1960s and early 70s to try to pull science fiction up to literature. And their efforts were successful. But now we're forgetting it and we're writing a lot of very just simple fantasies and simple space operas that aren't at that level. Shame on us for forgetting what those authors tried to teach us about writing, about literature. And we need, authors today need to sit down. This is what should be expected of you. You shouldn't be expected to produce stuff on the level of the 30s or 40s or 50s science fiction. You should be expected to produce stuff on the level of J.G. Ballard or Michael Moorcock or Harlan Ellison or Robert Silverberg in the late 60s or John Brunner in the late 60s. That's where you should be. And if you're failing to hit that mark, then you need to keep working on it. Obviously the publishers are going to publish what they think they can make money off of. And so they don't care if it's literature or not. But the rest of us should care. And we should demand that the writing be better, that the writing be more powerful. Because I go backward to Ray Bradbury and Ursula Le Guin and J.G. Ballard and read the stuff that they wrote in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. And it's like, God, this stuff is so much better. Why have we lost this? Why are people turning a blind eye to what was done? This is just so much more enjoyable to read. Let's go there. Let's go there. Let's push ourselves. Let's raise our expectations. Let's raise the bar and let's get it back up to where it should be. And, the publishers don't care about literature. They care about making money. Well, write stories that'll make money, but that are damn well-written stories, like Le Guin did when she sat down and wrote A Wizard of Earthsea. Do that with your fiction. And if you can't do that today, then work at it. Sit down and really push through it. If you're worth anything, you can do it. And then we can have some just amazing work to look back, to read and enjoy today, instead of having to go back to Christopher Priest or J.G. Ballard to get really, really excellent fiction. So read Bears Discover Singularity. It's a good story. I'm not giving it a top tail, but it is very remarkable and very interesting. And don't forget to read Bears Discover Fire first. Scratch your head over that one for a while, like me and Emily did. And then read Bears Discover Singularity and just think about where writing should be. Have you read Bears Discover Singularity? If you have, put your thoughts in the comments section of this video. I'd really love to hear them. Thoughts about Bears Discover Singularity, thoughts about Pamela Zoline, even thoughts about Bears Discover Fire. What the hell? Make your comments. I hope you'll hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and come on back. I'm probably going to, there's only 7 other works. I'm probably going to go through everything Pamela Zoline has done, if I can get a hold of them. Some of them are not in, some of them are in some obscure sources, I think, and so I may have trouble. But I'll try. Because she's an interesting writer. And so I hope you come back and join me for that. More from New Worlds that I haven't done just yet. And all the other things I do here on Telltale Books.